We're going to talk about 9/11. Now, this is one of the stories that we know. Were we living 20 years ago with the current rules of the internet, we may not be able to talk about this story. As it is right now, we are going to talk about newly released documents, a new court filing about inside involvement with 9/11 hijackers. We are going to do this with, the recently unredacted information. But again, it's interesting to note that, in this sort of authoritarian society that we're living in, we are going to talk about it under the rules we are still allowed to talk about. But we know that it would be different if this were a more recent story.
Oh, for sure. Now, one of the most heavily redacted documents in American history, it turns out, has to do with the 9/11 hijackers. Who knew? Who knew, right? If you wanted information about this, it was heavily redacted, almost entirely blacked out. You couldn't read it. Maybe even more so than the JFK documents that we get dumped on us on a regular basis by the Biden administration. Why did the U.S. government want to keep you in the dark, keep this information from you about 9/11? Well, it seems odd, right? Especially if they were all about transparency. I mean, they had a full-on events about 9/11 transparency on the Capitol steps about let's be as transparent and open as we possibly can. What happened on 9/11? We want to know about it. The families are demanding answers. We want to know. And Congress said, yes, absolutely. That's what we want. So if they had been truthful on that day, then why all the redactions in documents? Well, that heavily redacted document has just been unredacted. And thanks to a court proceeding at the Guantanamo Bay Military Court. Again, what you're about to hear is not our opinion. These are unredacted documents that were just revealed as part of a military court proceeding, to be clear. Right now, no U.S. media organizations, none that I can find, are covering this story. It's total media silence in the United States on this, but we're going to hear in a moment. But first, I want to give you some context about how we got here, a little history about what we were told happened on that fateful day in 2001. Let's turn to one of the worst websites in the world, arguably one of the worst websites in the world. That website is called Wikipedia, which is state-run propaganda. Here's what Wikipedia allows you to know about that day. Let's roll this. So this is right from their website. The September 11th attacks, commonly known as 9/11, were 4 coordinated suicide terrorist attacks carried out by the militant Islamic extremist network Al-Qaeda against the United States on September 11th, 2001. That morning, 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airliners scheduled to travel from the East Coast to California. The hijackers crashed the first 2 planes into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, which were 2 of the top 5 tallest buildings in the world at the time. Following the first 2 impacts, the 3rd and 4th flights were similarly coordinated to attack targets in the Washington metropolitan area. The 3rd plane succeeded in crashing into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense in Arlington County, Virginia, near the national capital of Washington, D.C. The 4th was intended to strike a federal government building in D.C. itself, but crashed in Stony Creek, Pennsylvania field following a passenger revolt. The attacks killed nearly 3,000 people and instigated the global war on terror. But here's my favorite part that's highlighted there on your screen. Within hours of the attacks, the Central Intelligence Agency determined that Al-Qaeda was responsible. Wow. These CIA guys are great, and they're fast, aren't they? They are super good. How did they figure it out so fast? Well, we must have some sort of intelligence apparatus. We must have the best intelligence apparatus in the world, or maybe was something else going on. Going over these documents.
Indestructible passports, too.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You explain that?
That were just found, just right then, that same day. Oh, here's a passport. Unscathed.
Yeah.
I don't know about this passport thing.
So if you go over these, if you go over these documents, going over these documents, sparked a memory for me of an FBI agent admitting on camera to CBS News a few years ago that these 19 hijackers were not working by themselves. No, they were working with people on the inside. I found that video for you. This is an FBI agent. Watch.
Danny Gonzalez was an FBI agent who worked on Operation Encore. He showed us the neighborhood the hijackers lived in before they crashed American Airlines Flight 77 into the Pentagon. This is Gonzalez's first television interview about the case.
19 hijackers cannot commit 3,000 mass murders by themselves.
Based on what you found, do you believe there was a domestic support network for the hijackers?
Obviously.
No question.
But I can't comment on it, but you don't have to be an FBI agent with 26 years of experience to figure that out.
Oh. So really any idiot could have figured that out.
All right, so we're going to link these things for you now. So what this document now says is that the FBI had been trying to figure out what the connection was between the hijackers and the CIA, and they have been thwarted for years, for decades now. And we're going to see exactly what that connection was. Now, was it that the CIA actually knew what they were going to do, or was it that they were connected to Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia knew what they were going to do? We're going to lay this out, what we know. We're going to maybe figure out why, although why is a big question, right? But we're going to at least figure out what we know and what the intelligence community has been building in terms of brick walls. Now, this recent court filing that was unredacted suggests that the 9/11 hackers, that two of them at least, were working with the CIA. This comes from Donald Canestraro. He's a veteran of the DIA and an investigator for the Office of Military Commissions. The Office of Military Commissions is a court of law for military cases, such as war crimes. Here's where the document where Canestraro tells us what his job is and how he's been looking. He says during the July of 2016, he began this investigation into possible involvement of the Saudi Arabian government and the CIA in the events leading up to the 9/11 attacks. In support of this inquiry, he began to review a discovery provided by the government to the defense and open source materials about Omar al-Bayoumi, a suspected Saudi intelligence officer who had contact with the 9/11 hijackers. These are the two in question that we're going to refer to often, Nawaf al-Hazimi and Khalid al-Midhar. So he conducted these 9/11 interviews, and he noticed that there had been an FBI file on al-Bayoumi released by Judicial Watch, to Judicial Watch by the FBI, pursuant to a FOIA request using a 199 numerical designator followed by the letters SD. And he said, most of the time when you see these things, it indicates that the investigation was conducted by the San Diego field office and that there was already a file. So the military court had asked him to investigate and examine if the CIA was working with the Saudi government and if these people had relations. Now, why would they do that? Now, over our break, I was reading up on Scott Horton's book, Enough Already, and he lays out one opinion. Now, this is just an opinion. Why would the CIA and the Saudi government want some kind of 9/11 event? Why would this benefit anybody? He says that Osama bin Laden had been explaining for years before the 9/11 attacks that he had been trying to lure Americans into personally fighting the wars Al-Qaeda members believed the U.S. was already waging against them. They blamed America for the actions of these various proxy forces in the region, primarily the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, as well as the Israeli occupation of Palestine. He says this is just one possible explanation of why, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what we know. So this is conjecture. By providing the American government a crisis to exploit, bin Laden guaranteed that the U.S. would set about accomplishing the terrorist goal for them. Among these were the destabilization of U.S.-supported regimes in the region, religious and political radicalization of populations in Middle Eastern countries, and most importantly, the bankruptcy of the American Treasury, with the ultimate goal of forcing the U.S. from the region entirely. So you see this shared goal of increased conflict in the Middle East, that this was Osama bin Laden's goal, and this was also the U.S. goal, and that these two things could be exploited by Saudi intelligence and by the CIA. Now, this is, again, just one possible why, but now let's go to the what. Canestraro says that he spoke to several 9/11 investigators in the FBI who were thwarted from doing their jobs. Now, this is the FBI continuously trying to figure out Who were these guys? What was their background? Why did they do this? And who helped them? And he has source after source that he speaks to of people saying that they started to get a link about these two hijackers and were stopped. Here is just one investigator. He says, I interviewed another 9/11 commissioner. He numbers his sources, CS1, CS2, all the way down to in the 20s of these people continuing to say the same thing. This second CS2 said that he or she was responsible for the 9/11 Commission's investigation into the possible link between the Saudi government and the 9/11 attacks. And this person noted that the staff director of the 9/11 Commission, Philip Zelikow, limited the number of witnesses that the commission could interview, and recalled that the FBI had Omar al-Bayoumi under investigation prior to the 9/11 attacks. And they said that it was their belief that Omar al-Bayoumi was receiving substantial sums of money from the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. prior to the attacks. This source, CS2, recalled that this money was being funneled from the bank accounts at Riggs Bank belonging to this person, the wife of the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. Now, al-Bayoumi was associated with the Saudi diplomat who worked at the consulate in Los Angeles. Why was he receiving money from the consulate? Well, he says because he was a Saudi intelligence officer who was linked to these two hijackers that we talked about.
And phone
Nawaf
calls.
al-Hazimi and Khalid al-Midar. It's more than phone calls. It's also like, where did he live? What were his jobs? He had several no-show jobs where he was getting paid for jobs that he never did. And the intelligence community knew this.
Well, and yeah, but the phone calls with the hijackers. So, like, if you have no connection with them, why did this then turn up in Operation Encore?
Phone calls as well as dinners in restaurants where they sort of came, went by and sort of it looked like a movie, sort of shady reports where it's like, here's a paper and keep going,
Yeah.
Jason Bourne style.
Yeah, and this all came out, not all of it. Pieces of this came out in Operation Encore, just like a scraping of it came out in Operation Encore, which was a decades-long investigation
Yes.
by the FBI into any sort of homegrown affiliation or involvement in this attack. This is what, of course, the 9/11 victims' families were demanding for years, was an investigation. And they found, all the Saudis were also involved in this.
Yes. Now, this CS2 source, this is, again, just one of over 20, stated that because of finding this information, they were fired from this Philip Zelikow, who was the head of the 9/11 Commission. The Zelikow in this document that I'm showing you here says that, what they did was a minor security violation, but it was used as a scapegoat to fire them. And CS2 noted, look towards the bottom, that sometime before this termination, Zelikow had blocked the request to conduct interviews and obtain documents pertaining to this inquiry. And then Zelikow seized the index from this person at the time and did not let anyone else on the commission see it. And that CS2, this source, stated that the former deputy staff director of the 9/11 Commission may know where it is currently located. So they're hidden documents. Another source tells Canestraro that they had notified the CIA of the presence of these two hijackers in the U.S. and stated that they were possibly terrorists, and they were told to stand down. And they were told this was not their jurisdiction. In fact, CS3, another source, says that they were told by the CIA not to cooperate in any congressional hearings about the 9/11 Commission. So here is that statement from CS3, stated that before he and his colleagues were interviewed by the 9/11 Commission, they were told by CIA officials that they were not to cooperate fully with congressional investigators. CS3, this source, stated that the justification the CIA used was that the investigators were just looking to hang someone for 9/11. I don't know what kind of justification that seems like. Like, they just want answers, so don't give them answers. They just want to pin it on somebody, so let's not cooperate. Further, here's why CS3 thinks this happened. This is their opinion. It's made clear in the court documents, so let's not all take it to the bank. But CS3, the source, says that he or she believed that the CIA prevented the distribution of these documents because they did not want the FBI interfering with a CIA operation that was being run domestically in violation of U.S. law. CS3 explained that these two terrorists were living in San Diego in 2000 and that Omar al-Bayoumi was working for the Saudi intelligence service when he spoke to these two hijackers in San Diego. According to CS3, al-Bayoumi, this connection that we think is Saudi intelligence, set up bank accounts, rented an apartment for the attackers in San Diego, and that this was done at the behest of the CIA through the Saudi intelligence service. According to this source, prior to the 9/11 attacks, the CIA had been under pressure to recruit informants within al-Qaeda. Responding to this pressure, this person and the colleagues at the CIA were attempting to recruit these two via a liaison relationship with the Saudi intelligence. So the CIA, what they're saying, was wanting to maybe not exploit a war, but instead recruit people inside of al-Qaeda. And they sort of overlooked that these people were then going to go on and do a bigger terrorist attack. Either way, we're not being told the truth, right? Either they did know or they didn't know, but they were, in fact, in contact with these two people for whatever reason, and we're not being told the truth.
Yeah. And there's so many other deep, and this is just one court document that's been unredacted. So that's what we're giving you right here, right? But this, if you tie some of the pieces together from previous statements from both eyewitnesses and people who were on the investigative body of this, who were then sort of pushed out, it all lines up. But it does raise the question, right? We shouldn't be naive. Is this just some sort of a limited hangout? A piece of information to throw us off the track, right? Anytime stories like this come out, I'm always wondering the deeper story here. Like, we're going to get to the Ukraine leaks in just a moment, but what is the deeper thing that we're being led away from? Or is this the Holy Grail? Because there's a lot here that we still haven't touched on. We're not going to talk about it in this episode. I have a whole video that I've been working on, deep research on Flight 93, totally separate from this topic. There's all sorts of discussions, of course, about the buildings in Manhattan and all of that, and what happened to the Pentagon and all sorts of things. So, again, is there something that we're supposed to be being led away from? Like, it's a good question to ask, right? Are we being led by? We give you this, but then the main. See, when I pull back on that, and here's why: no one in the United States media is covering this.
Yes,
no one. And normally, if they wanted us to be led away from something, the New York Times would have this as a front page story. The Washington Post would be covering it. It would be everywhere, right? But there's media silence in the United States on that. So they would be doing the bidding of the deep state.
Yes, it's...
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think it's like parallels. It's like you have so many people, like you have so many of these things that have happened throughout history, and you have people that still are focused on JFK, still are focused on 9/11, still are focused on these things, and they're still doing the fight, and they're bringing out more information. We've already moved past it because we're way up here now. So I think we're just seeing, because I'm seeing a lot of these narratives start to fall apart, which is good.
Yeah, especially when it comes to the CIA involvement. Exactly.
Yeah.
But as I've been sort of continuing to study, wars in the Middle East, especially, and how the United States picks and chooses who they support in these wars, and usually it is a faction of al-Qaeda or some kind of offshoot. In fact, these wars in Iraq, like these terrorists could sort of just cross the border into Syria, join al-Nusra, and all of a sudden they're on the U.S. They just switch sides, right? Because the United States is just supporting whoever. It's really willy-nilly. But it does show a parallel between how the United States can use someone until they don't need them any longer, and how that reverberates and has dangerous consequences for everybody, not just Americans, but everybody. When you read about how the United States had a really cozy relationship with Saddam Hussein, and then all of a sudden they needed him to be the bad guy and they made him the bad guy. Same thing can be said with Bashar al-Assad. And so if we don't follow these parallels and see what the United States has in store for Zelensky, it's a template, right? And it's scary. And so even if you think that you're supporting Ukraine, and you really like Zelensky, then you need to sort of follow this template. Because it's scary what's going to happen when you run out of your use value.
We know how this story ends for Zelensky.
Yeah. Now, I want to go back to the document because in this same vein of U.S. involvement and sort of exploiting the governments that it needs when it can't do so directly, there's this source that's CS7. CS7 is an unnamed investigative journalist for CNN who stated that Israel and Saudi Arabia have acted as proxies for the CIA since the 70s and 80s. CS7 says that there was a group called the Safari Club that was used to block Soviet influence in the Middle East by exchanging intelligence between member nations and engaging in covert action. CS7 stated that the club included the governments of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other states in the Middle East and North Africa, and that they used this bank to do so. What they were basically doing was doing CIA operations in areas where the CIA could not operate. CS7 told me that Osama Bassan was an informant for the Saudi General Intelligence Directorate. And according to the CNN source CS7, investigation by the FBI immediately following the 9/11 attacks showed that this person was associated with these two hijackers we told you about, Al-Hazmi and Al-Mindar. And so this goes on, like I said, through source CS23, admitting that they had knowledge of suspects and links to the CIA and continuously were being told to stop looking where they're looking. Mostly it's the FBI looking into something and the CIA telling them to stop. Now, Senator Robert Graham is also a source, but he is a named source in this report. He says that when he interviewed him in 2016, Senator Graham said this about his time as the co-chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He said he's personally familiar with the workings of both the Senate and House joint inquiry into the events of 9/11, and he acknowledged that the investigation inquiry conducted by the 9/11 Commission said that it was apparent neither the joint inquiry nor the 9/11 Commission had fully explored the involvement of the government of Saudi Arabia in the events leading up to the 9/11 attacks, as in they just left it on the floor. They left it on the cutting room floor. Now, this was, of course, congressional investigation. We've learned now that we don't expect much. Congress doesn't have much power except to go on TV and hold hearings that maybe impress you and drop, sort of whatever it is they want us to see. But it does continue to lead to the question, why? Why was the FBI thwarted when they were trying to follow this breadcrumb trail? Why was Congress stopped in its tracks? And what is the CIA not wanting us to see?
Yeah.
And so we're forced to draw our own conclusions, which is why I gave you sort of these alternate versions of why, but we still really don't know why because we're being told nothing.
Right. And why were they thwarted later? It seems like the narrative was unfolding and certain things were allowed to proliferate. They were allowed to go and detain people for hours in solitary confinement. Remember the 5 Israelis who were caught on camera with I love how they described it, with puzzling behavior after the attacks happened. Puzzling behavior, huh? How did you describe it? Neighbors described it as joy and dancing. But they described it as puzzling behavior, and they were put in solitary confinement by the FBI, and they were questioned for hours upon hours. Like, why were they allowed to do that, right? There's all sorts of weird things that they're allowed to investigate. They're not thwarted at this stuff. If there's certainly involvement from these different governments, there was also questions and reports about Saudi aircraft, Saudi state aircraft being allowed to leave when the entire airspace was shut down. So many more questions, but I love any little nugget of information that pulls a thread that allows us to see a little bit more information here.
Well, it's extremely uncomfortable because it's comfortable to say like, oh, these 9/11, conspiracy theorists, they think this or that or the other. I want to hear what you have to say, Philip, but I just want to say this quickly. On the 20th anniversary of September 11th, I think it was the New York Times did this whole expose about a 9/11 a father of a victim that was on the planes, who went way deep down this rabbit hole and was really convinced that there was something to, the inside job theory. And everyone just treated him like a crazy person. And she didn't validate his questions. She didn't, continue to ask the questions that he had unanswered. It was just like, look at this sad man who cannot get over it 20 years later because of his son. And it got to the point where his wife was like, they would go to a dinner party and be like, please don't bring up 9/11. I just can't have this be a part of our every social interaction, even though it was their son who had died. And so it's more comfortable to treat this as a conspiracy theory than it is to look at all the gaping holes. Go ahead, Philip, please.
Oh yeah, I was going to say that's one of the benefits of getting to investigate yourself is that you already know what you don't want to find. And so
Yeah.
it's a lot easier to not find it when you already know what you're looking to obfuscate. You know?
Right.
So
Right.
I was just
Yeah.
kind of like, you know,
Yeah, exactly. You know how to divert the questions really quickly. You know, we see that all the time when someone asks an uncomfortable question at a public event, you know, of a
Yeah.
politician, and the crowd's like, "Oh, no," and they all just kind of divert attention to something else.
Well, I'm extremely uncomfortable with this because of the way it's so like mainstream labeled as conspiracy.
Right. Oh, you're a crackpot for questioning anything about that day.
Yeah.
You can't question anything about Flight 93. Well, I'm from Pennsylvania. There's a lot of questions about Flight 93, which we're doing a whole deep dive redacted history about. So you'll see that video soon.
Nice.
And there's a lot of questions about the Manhattan buildings. There's a lot of questions about the Pentagon. There's so many other questions about the involvement of the Saudis and Israel. And so you go down many rabbit holes on this. But anyway, thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.